everyone. We're back from St. Mark's Episcopal Church. This is Rev'd Up for Sunday. I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
I'm Rob Schwartz.
I'm John Kennedy.
Today we come to one of the grimmest of all of Jesus's parables. So let's cut right to the chase and get to the text. There's a lot to talk about in this juicy story. Here we go. This is from Matthew 21:33 to 46. Jesus said, "Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally he sent his son to them, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance.' So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these tenants?" They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, 'The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone'? This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard this parable, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet.
Fun stuff.
Yeah, it's a blast.
You know
Laugh
what?
a minute with Jesus.
You know, this is week 3 now in a row that we've got all this stuff about God and the vineyard and all this. So I thought, skip the t-shirt today, but I wanted to do something that was appropriate. I figured I was really craving grapes after that.
I thought you were going to bring out a bottle of wine.
Well, I was going to go for a bottle of wine, but we're on the clock right now, so.
Shall we seize him and take his share?
That's right.
Thanks, Rob. We got grapes here for all those who are just listening and not watching all this drama unfold on the table.
That's right.
And if you want to give us extra views, you can listen and then watch.
I think I'm
Even
just going
better.
to stuff grapes in my mouth and let you guys talk about this.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
What do you think, John?
But yeah, who can situate us? John, you want to situate us?
Sure,
Matthew
yeah.
21?
This time we're picking up right where we left off last time. So Jesus is now in Jerusalem. I think he's still in the temple. He has already flipped the tables in the temple. So he's really turned the heat up with regards to his conflict with the religious leaders. And it just continues here. He's telling his second of 5 parables that are all directed against the religious leaders. So we have to remember here that, Jesus, of course, ends up crucified at the end of this week. And it's not as though he just showed up in Jerusalem and they're like, "Get him." He's fairly confrontational here. You have to wonder how much of this was sort of his own doing in a way. Not suggesting that it wasn't already building off of an opposition that was due to his championing, those who were oppressed, forgotten, marginalized, and speaking truth to power. But nonetheless, Jesus is sort of stoking the fire significantly with these parables. I mean, he's still in dialogue with these guys, right? They're still going back and forth. They're still having some sort of rabbinic debate. He even tells the parable and then asks them, what do you think about this? What should the landowner do? We'll get into the allegory of this parable soon. But they're like, he should put them to death. And then Jesus is like, this is spoken against you. So it's really interesting to see Jesus very boldly, kind of brazenly, clash with people who will ultimately conspire according to the text of the Gospels, conspire with the Roman authorities to have him put to death. It's really kind of breathtaking when you think about this being an actual man who's doing this.
Well, and as with all these parables, Jesus always is putting these stories in a context that people of his time would really understand, that, your everyday person. And so he's telling these things. And so for us, this situation, trying to figure out what's going on with this landowner and tenants and slaves and all that, kind of might sound a little strange to us or foreign to us, but to them it would have made total sense.
Totally.
You'd have these landowners who would, buy their vineyard and set all this stuff up, and then you'd have tenants who would work it, and kind of in exchange that he'd be getting kind of some of the crops, a share of the crops. So it's like, you live here, you work it, but I get something out of it. And if they weren't doing their job, you would think naturally the landowner would move on to others. Mm-hmm. And but in this case, we get some tenants who are very uncooperative, violently so.
Yeah. I mean, I think Jesus, we can't forget he's talking to leaders of the temple and, Pharisees, I guess, or the authorities in the temple. And he's making such a clear allusion here to Isaiah. There's a passage in Isaiah 5 that talks about Israel, God's plan for Israel. God literally in Isaiah plants a vineyard, puts a fence around it, builds a watchtower. That's something David was meant to do, and Solomon went on to do it, and sets it up. And then in Isaiah, it goes on to say how the grapes grew wildly, and were out of control, and God had to find other tenants, or so Jesus is speaking to people who know their scriptures, and it's such a very transparent allusion there. And so if Jesus goes on with that metaphor, to seize the slaves that the owner sends, there's two groups of slaves here, and possibly he's alluding to the pre-exile prophets, Amos and those early prophets, and the post-exile prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on. And, all the prophets are sort of ignored and killed ultimately, And so, of course, here's Jesus says, but what if the owner sends his very son? Of course they'll respect the son, knowing full well, Jesus, that of course they're looking at him and they don't. And even then John the Baptist got killed, Yep. So I think that's one of the setups here. And it's actually in a series of, as you mentioned, John, it's in this series of parables. Jesus has been in the temple now for at least a while, talking to them. And this is actually, I calculated maybe the third of 4 parables about his authority that all follow this question of authority. And last week we faced that question, on what basis do you do these things, Jesus? And Jesus challenges their question with, well, who did you think sent John the Baptist? Was he human or origin, or was his authority from God or from humans? And they couldn't answer because John the Baptist was so popular, and Jesus would trap them if they said it was human. And so anyway, he's really given them a tour de force of challenges about how they're handling their own authority and how they're managing God's temple and God's sort of plan for Israel.
Yeah.
So he's incredibly astute with the scriptures. I mean, just to understate it completely. But to me, that's kind of one of the setups, is just he's talking to his own people who know their scriptures as well as he does.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Indeed, yes. And I think the Isaiah connection is totally right on. I think it's clearly what Jesus is drawing on. Mm-hmm. And it's striking because, right, this is from Isaiah chapter 5, which, according to how Isaiah is grouped, divided nowadays by scholars. You have first and second and maybe even third Isaiah. So this would be from first Isaiah, which is thought to be written by the Isaiah, the guy himself, which would have been in Judah during the period before the Babylonian exile. So this is before things go really south for these people. And there's a warning here that something bad will come if you don't get your act together, specifically if you don't walk in the way that your God has called you to walk in. And it's made very clear here that what God expects is justice, but what God sees is bloodshed. God expects righteousness, but here's a cry that's in the Isaiah text. So this cycle has happened before. That God calls God's people to live in a certain way, to bear the fruit of good works, and to live in a way that is just and equitable for all people in the land. And the people, God's people fail to do it. And so calamity comes upon them. And Jesus is echoing echoing this and saying that this is going to happen again. Well, it does happen again, right? I mean, you can look at the judgment on the religious leaders that Jesus refers to as being either the final judgment or the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 A.D., just a little while after Jesus's lifetime. It's probably, I would say, based on what I was reading, probably primarily with the destruction of the temple in mind, because in the next parable, which is really just building off of this one, Jesus talks about the Lord sending armies to burn the city, which sounds very much like what happened in 70 A.D. So that's got to be at least part of the reference here. And it is striking, and it's challenging, right, to think that this is not just about the people of Israel. This is not just about the Jewish people. This is about people generally, that when we know better, when we have, in this case, received revelation from God, right, that this is the way, as the Mandalorian says.
John, I'm loving the Star Wars references.
That this is the way, and we struggle to follow in the way. It's kind of scary if you think that we're on the hook here too, because we're just people like these people. I'd say that's part of the challenge for me in thinking about this. One thing I want to say in terms of scriptural references, just before we get further into sort of like what it means for us today, is this seems to be echoing the book of Daniel as well, because we have Psalm 118 quoted about the rejected stone that becomes the cornerstone, and that it will smash all those who fall upon it, which is what Jesus says will happen to the religious leaders he's in conflict with. Well, in the book of Daniel, we have King Nebuchadnezzar who has a dream. And he's like, what does this dream mean? So he gets Daniel to interpret the dream to him. And in the dream, there's this statue, and the head is made of gold, and the chest and the arms are made of silver, and the midsection and thighs or whatever are made of bronze, and then the legs of iron, and the feet of a mixture of clay and iron. And then the whole thing is smashed into a million pieces by this stone, this like divinely sent, consecrated, whatever, ordained stone to do God's work. And the statue represents various kingdoms. There's the kingdom of Babylon is the one at the head of gold, and then obviously by the fact that the materials get less and less valuable, the idea is that things are getting worse and worse with these successive kingdoms. Right. And so you have Babylon, and then the various Hellenistic powers, and that Persia, and then the various Hellenistic powers, and then Rome, and the prophecy, or it taken as a prophecy, it can be seen to mean that the Messiah will smash them all. This is a way that Jewish people of Jesus' time might have looked at this. And Jesus seems to be thinking that is using it in a way to suggest that it's not just the other kingdoms of the world, but it's pointed at you too, the people who think that they're sort of safe, that they're sort of God's people and protected from divine judgment. That basically everybody everybody's got to play by the same rules. That God's kingdom is at hand. God's kingdom is coming, and the question is like, will you live according to the way of the kingdom? And if not, you have some stuff to deal with. Yeah.
And I think one thing that's kind of interesting to look at too is when you compare. So this is a story that runs through at least the synoptic gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and some of the differences, you can see little things that Matthew's specifically trying to point out, where for Mark they're just like little things. Like Mark just says, a man planted a vineyard and leased it to tenants, went away. Matthew, the term he uses is basically saying a master of a house. So it's kind of showing that, that the kind of higher level of the landowner there, and that it was kind of a hierarchical master in society, and they say also a godlike master or a king in Matthew's context. But also the other one I really like, there's a lot of talk throughout Matthew of fruitfulness, bearing fruit and things like that. We've heard that in a couple of the podcasts already. And so Matthew says the harvest time had come, and Mark just says the season came. So this idea of the harvest and being plentiful and bearing fruit, or what kind of spiritual fruits we don't bear, a lot of that really plays out. So I think there's a lot of intentionality when we really look for the word cues that he's using in this.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly long-standing metaphor to use the grapes and the vineyard and the vintner and producing a harvest and so on. And I think for Jesus, ultimately, it's about, can you see or not see that the kingdom is right here in front of you, and will you step into it or not? And I think that all of these parables have to do. We had 3 weeks ago, we had the unforgiving servant, the one who was forgiven everything, that was $1 billion of debt, and then turned around and wouldn't forgive his $10 for the coffee he lended last week, and got his friend thrown into prison. And then last week we had this generous vineyard owner, the house manager, or the, vine grower, who hired workers and paid them all the same, those who worked 1 hour, those who worked 12 hours. And then, this week we have this one about that we've read. And each time it's like, will you recognize or not that God is incredibly inviting? God is incredibly ready to accept, whether actually you live in the way or not. It's more like, will you believe? Will you accept that Jesus is the one sent? And he's always, in each case, he's talking to these Pharisees or these authorities who are kind of gatekeepers and the watchers of waiting for the Messiah. And, they're vetting all these pretenders and charlatans that might come through. Yeah. So it made sense that they would ask Jesus, where do you get your authority and who do you think you are? And they're the gatekeepers. So Jesus is telling such pointed stories to them that to me are just challenging. Can they accept the one who comes in a way they don't expect? And here, the problem with this parable and extrapolating it out into, God's going to crush the kingdom who won't accept him, is that that's not what happened. The son was killed. It's the listeners to Jesus here who have to answer what's going to happen next. Jesus says, what do you think they're going to do next? And logically they say, he'll put those wretches to a miserable death, and lease the vineyards to someone else. But that's not actually what happens. Jesus is killed and comes back in forgiveness and peace and still invites everybody in, still wants the tenants to stay and accept the kingdom and move into it. Nobody gets cast out just because they put Jesus to death. We cast ourselves out all the time. But to me, the revelation, and as you know, I'm kind of steeped in the Girardian school of, imitative violence.
Only a matter of time before it came back.
It's been a while, friends. I know you've missed Girard, but he's always on my mind. And this is a school of thought that says that, the revelation of Jesus was to expose our cycles of violence that never end and to show us how trapped we are in expelling our scapegoats and in thinking that we'll have lasting peace by doing that. Repeating violence and repeating violence, we think that finally we'll settle the scores and have peace. But it never works. And this parable is so clearly that, it would make sense in that lens that the tenants kill one slave and then another. And, each time they think, well, now we can keep the vineyard to ourselves. And each time they repeat the same thing, and so Jesus' crucifixion becomes just one more example in many of, this kind of scapegoat, the victim that, we think we can get rid of in order to have lasting peace. And the difference, what makes Jesus's killing unique is that he's the Son of God, and that he comes back, he's raised up to come back in forgiveness and peace and to put an end to this cycle, if we'll recognize that that's what we've done, you know, and that to be given, you know, also handed the whole of everything, like we talked about last week with the generous vineyard owner who pays everyone the same. You know, it wasn't about getting a reward. It was about having a place, having a thing, some meaning, you know, having a place at the table, right? I mean, Rob preached beautifully about this parable, that the reason all those lately come workers, that no one hired them. They had a story. They were stuck. And, you know, to be given everything like everyone else was something to celebrate, you know? And so, I don't know, I'm probably droning a little bit, but I feel like the parable also exposes that the instinct of the authorities, or, you know, any of us too would say the same thing. Of course he's going to put those wretches to a miserable death. You know, that's what we do. That's how we go, is we just keep killing. You know, we keep punishing instead of kind of stopping it. And, you know, even when the sun comes, we, you know, because they want to take God's produce, and they want the vineyard as well, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. You know, they'll just keep committing violence. They're willing to pay violence to just commit violence.
Well, and I like that you brought the, you know, the direction of this toward, you know, toward the Son and all that, and toward Jesus in the story, because it's so easy to read this and focus so much on what's happening with these tenants and, you know, what they're doing and the violence they're committing. But it's almost like as soon as the Son, and as soon as we get to that excerpt there about the stone the builders rejected and all of that, it really shifts the meaning or the focus of this. And you know, a kind of, one commentator, I love that he said, it goes from the parable of the wicked tenants to maybe the parable of the rejected and vindicated son. And so that's really, nice. You know, the focus of this is Jesus and that you know, how they treated him and lifting that up. But what do you guys think of the language? So I know the Gerardian stuff helps a lot to kind of work through the complicated human actions and all of that, and we've got a lot of violent actions here. But what about this kind of violent imagery we get? The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls. Like, you know, if you're just reading that, you're like, oh wow, this is pretty intense.
Yeah.
Matthew, I'll say a quick word, and then I know you have a lot to say about this. You know, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Blessed is the one who doesn't consider me a stumbling block." You know,
right.
there's this imagery of a stumbling block, and of course, Jesus's stone. You know, that stumbling block is, you know, he's the one who's willing to suffer our violence and willing to be rejected and willing to be the one the builders reject, and that's. None of us want to embrace that. I mean, to be willing to suffer violence and rejection, that's a stumbling block to just about everyone. You know, that's and that becomes the cornerstone of our community. You know, the cornerstone of Jesus's way and movement is to be nonviolent. And so, you know, anyway, I think that that's quite a stumbling block. And to be crushed by that is to just sort of crushed in spirit. You know, I don't think I can do it. You know, smash to smithereens with all of our expectations.
Yeah, indeed. And, you know, I mean, we talked, you mentioned recently that, you know, God is the great allower. And part of how I look at this whole drama of Jesus being sent to his own people and his own people not receiving him, and the consequences of that is that, you know, Jesus is God, as St. Paul writes, reconciling the world to himself. But if we're not persuaded to at least try, you know, to embrace this person, to embrace this way, God will not necessarily save us from the consequences of our own violence, of our own, you know, of our own greed, of our own selfishness. And I think, you know, if we take the words in the Gospels attributed to Jesus that seem to be prophetic of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, and certainly we can be confident that the writers of the Gospel had this in mind, you know, the way that perhaps this is part of how this is meant to be understood, is that if you stumble over this stone that the builders rejected, if you're part of the group of those who reject him, you will fall and be smashed into a million pieces, because the way of the wicked tenants here, which Jesus is applying to the religious leaders he's clashing with, leads to destruction. Abundantly clear that humanity is not protected from the consequences of our own greed and violence and other destructive tendencies. It plays out over and over again all the time, very, very sadly, just as much now as then. So
it snowballs.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Agree. I really want to be clear that I don't believe that necessarily the landowner here is the God figure. I think it's really a good metaphor for human behavior, and that it's a God figure kind of, but it doesn't end that way. I don't think the story ends that way, and I don't think Jesus' stories are a straight line.
Interesting.
Tied up with the bow. But it's the Methian, the listeners here that say that's what he's going to do. He's going to put those people to a miserable death. So in each case, even in our time, as we live out and reject Jesus in all our different ways, reject the earth and hurt it and do harm and do violence, it's not like God's going to come back and put us to a miserable death, and we're not the wretches that are going to be smashed to smithereens. It's true, as you say. I feel like we stumble into our own traps, and we pay the consequences of our own actions, and the saving is just turning. We are saved by that invitation to just turn around.
What's something you said a few episodes ago or something like that, saying basically that we create our own hell. We kind of set ourselves up. We can turn.
I think I was quoting someone who said, if you don't want to be in the kingdom, then you can go to hell. I mean, that's where you go.
No, but you know what I mean? It's kind of like people are living through hell, and sometimes, and people are living through hell who haven't done anything wrong, but I don't mean it so much that way. Yeah. But the fact that it's kind of like how you choose to live is kind of what you set yourself up for in some ways. And so that's where I kind of go with it. Yeah.
Wow. Well, we've taken up all our time, and there's so much more to go to talk about this, so maybe we'll talk offline. But thanks for joining us. This is such a rich parable, and there's a lot to really chew on here. We'll chew on the grapes when we sign off here. Thanks, Rob. But please remember that we have our podcast line. We've been waiting by the phone. We don't have any voicemails. Yeah. We'd love a few calls. You can tell us that we're
lonely, please.
Take us on, give us some challenges. That number is 203-442-5002. Leave us a voicemail. And thanks for joining us. So please like, subscribe, share this podcast if you have a chance, and we'll see you in church. God bless you.